Yes, good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the first in our new season of webinars. The season goes from May to August, and then the final one of the year will obviously be September to December. And we have 72 season ticket holders, not all of whom are here. We reckon about half the season ticket holders turn up to any one meeting. And it's a real pleasure to have Rolf Sattler with us. We did a book briefing a few months ago about his very interesting book, Science and Beyond, which is really sort of archetypally, I think, a network book in contextualizing science within society and philosophy, and understanding also the power structure of knowledge and which views are powerful and which are less powerful. And actually, we were just talking about this in relation to life beyond death with Jerome before coming on. So what Rolf's going to be talking about, what are the consequences of widespread misconceptions about science? And he explores these, and they can have serious consequences for individual and society, as we've seen over the last 2 years. And so it's really important that science should know what it can say something about and what it can't, and what is beyond it. And that calls for a much more creative and cooperative relationship between science and philosophy. And interestingly, one of Rolf's books is Organogenesis of Flowers and Biophilosophy. And he taught courses on a number of topics, including philosophy and history of biology and biology and the human condition. And he's taught in many different universities around the world. He's also a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. So Rolf, a very warm welcome to you. He says it's just warming up, just getting above 0 degrees. Sounds very cold to me. And luckily it's a bit warmer down here, but not that warm. So over to you.
Thank you very much, David. I really appreciate being able to talk here about one of my favorite topics. I've been working as a scientist my whole life, and so of course science is close to my heart, but I've also been engaged in many activities beyond science. So for this reason, Science and Beyond is a topic that I like to talk about. Now, I think we can all agree that in our society today, science coupled with technology has become the major force. And yet, as David already said, surprisingly, there are many widespread misconceptions about science. And these misconceptions, first of all, they distort science. And secondly, they obscure what's beyond science. And so for these reasons, I think it seems to me very important to reflect about this topic. So let me get to the first misconception. I can hear about it all the time. Well, what do I hear? Scientifically proven. This is scientifically proven, that is scientifically proven, and so on and so on. But there is no proof in science. There is no final word in science, because science is open-ended. If we make an observation today that appears or seems to prove something, well, how do we know whether the same observation tomorrow or a month later or next year will confirm this or not? It may be same, it may be different, but we don't know the future. So for that reason, there is no final word, there is no proof. Or if we make an experiment today, and how can we know whether it turns out the same way tomorrow or next year? So there is really no final word in science. And yet, to my amazement, and I simply don't understand it at all, many people, laypersons, people in government, and also many scientists talk about proof. It's really beyond my comprehension how this is possible. So to give you one well, people sometimes, if they repeat the experiments again and again, and then they say, now, well, it has been confirmed and now we really know it has been proven. But even that, even if it has been successfully repeated many, many times, or an observation many, many times, it's no proof. I give you an example, a standard example that philosophers of science often use, white swans. Now, in Europe, before they discovered the black swans in Australia, they saw only white swans. So they saw hundreds and thousands of times white swans. And so they might have thought, well, we've seen it so often, so it has been proven swans are white. But they didn't know what the future would bring, and the future actually brought the discovery of black swans. So I think we should write black swans in great letters in every science lab or in government offices and so on, and remind people that there is no proof in science. Now, why is this so important to me? It's important to me because if we believe in proof, as so many people and scientists do, once we have proven something, then the matter is closed. Well, we have the proof, so why look around further? No need to inquire further. We have the proof, we have the final word. So this really narrows down things very much and leads to closed-mindedness. And furthermore, it tends to lead to dogmatism. Well, we have the proof, we know it. And intolerance. And these are, we are all familiar with that. These are very negative consequences that may have grave and sometimes devastating consequences. So for this reason, this is a very important topic for me. And I just, I don't know how one can change that, because I've been talking to so many people about that, and 1 hour later they continue talking about proof. Now, there's also no disproof. This is more difficult to show why there is no disproof. There are a number of reasons. The first one is psychological, I think, because people like very much if they find evidence that disproves, that contradicts the theory of their opponents, they are very, very happy about that. But they don't like to find evidence that contradicts their own theory. So psychologically speaking, this is not something people want. They just reject it, and they get to all sorts of ad hoc hypotheses to accommodate contradictory evidence. They just don't want to have their favorite ideas and theories disproven. And another reason is a more general one is it has been pointed out that facts that normally are thought to disprove theories if we get contradictory facts. Facts are also theory laden. They are less theoretical than the theories that are being tested, but there is also a theoretical component in facts. And obviously you cannot disprove one hypothetical thing by another one. So therefore, yeah, it is difficult, impossible, I think, to absolutely disprove a theory or any scientific tenet. It's not easy to find the theoretical element in facts, but I can give you one example from my own research. I have done research in plant morphology on the development and evolution of plants. And if you make a very simple statement like, this leaf is green, we look at a leaf and we see it's green, and we say this is green, we think that's a fact. What's the theory behind that? Well, first of all, there are different theories of color. There is the predominant one developed by Newton, and then there is a very alternative, very different theory of colors developed by Goethe. And depending on which theory you like, Newton's or Goethe's, you would, this statement, the color statement, that leaf is green, would have a different meaning. And also, there are different morphological theories about plants and different conceptions of leaves. So depending on which one you subscribe to, the leaf would have a different meaning. There is something theoretically implied in that concept of the leaf. So this leaf is green, which seems so factual. It contains theoretical elements. And for this reason, as I said, you cannot disprove one theory by something else that's hypothetical. And so it seems to me that disproof is also impossible, although it's not quite as evident, I must admit, not quite as evident as the fact that that proof is impossible. So it seems we are in science, we have to live with uncertainty, no final word, uncertainty. And to some scientists, outstanding scientists, this is actually something positive. But to many others, it's considered negative. But be it positive or negative, it's something I think in science at least, we have to live with. But beyond science, I think we can actually be beyond uncertainty. For example, well, first of all, uncertainty exists in space and time. So if we can go beyond space and time, I think we can also go beyond uncertainty. And how do we go beyond space and time? Well, there are many, many, many different ways. For example, there is a Shiva meditation, which says, put the palms of your hands over your eyes like a feather, really lightly touching, and focus on the third eye. And when I do that, I'm immediately beyond space and time. Now, this may not work so well for some of you, but there are many other meditations. There are actually 112 Shiva meditations. And if you look at those, most likely you find one that works very well for you and transports you instantly beyond space and time. And that means beyond uncertainty. And there are, of course, very simple methods like becoming totally immersed in beauty, in a like beautiful flower or beautiful meadow. One can really dissolve in it, and there's no longer a question of uncertainty in that moment. Or in total laughter. In total laughter, you know, there is no longer any uncertainty, because in total laughter, as someone pointed out, you go immediately beyond space and time, beyond uncertainty. Someone said total laughter is like a shortcut to nirvana. I led laughter yoga meditations for many, many years. And we laughed almost continuously for half an hour or an hour. And I can tell you, you are really in a different state of mind, and you don't worry about what's happening next moment or what happened before, or all these issues of uncertainty. So I think in our personal life, in our personal subjective experience, we can go beyond uncertainty. And therefore, the title of my book is Science and Beyond. Now, let me turn to a second misconception that is also very widespread. There is, I should say, beyond science, we find, let me see, I just, the word escapes me, uniqueness, I'm sorry, uniqueness. Like, for example, a flower or a person or whatever is very, very unique, and each one different. Therefore, we say unique. But science is not interested in uniqueness. Science doesn't deal with uniqueness. Science abstracts from the uniqueness traits that can be replicable. Replicability, as you know, is a major aim in science. And by definition, what's replicable is not unique. And by definition, what's unique cannot be replicated. Any unique event that happens only once and is unique is not replicable. So that is outside, beyond science. And to me, this is very important, because sometimes we look at nature, at objects, at people, just in terms of generalities, and do not value sufficiently the uniqueness of each particular object or person. And so I think an appreciation and the celebration of uniqueness is very important to me, and it is beyond science, because as you know, replicability is so important in science. Now, there are also problems with replicability in science. In fact, there are many problems with it. And we think that if something cannot be, events cannot be, or experiments cannot be replicated, then the experiment that had been done before, or the observation that had been done before, must be wrong. But I think this is a fallacious conclusion, because we know that whatever we observe or experiment on is context dependent, depends on the context. If the context changes, then the observation and the result of the experiment may also change. And I think that's a really fundamental problem for science, because we know contexts are always changing. Now, sometimes the different contexts may not change the result of the experiment, but in other cases it may be. And so if we consider the context, this actually may be the reason why replication is often so difficult. It's a very thorny problem in science, I think. The context is very often forgotten. It's very often taken for granted, but it plays a very important role. And that is, I think, also a message that I wanted to convey in my book. Uniqueness and replicability, very fascinating topics. Related to that are the topics of subjectivity and objectivity. We always hear and are being told that science is objective. But what does that mean? I think it can mean two things. Many people understand mean by objectivity, or when something is considered object, that it's real. But what's real, we don't know. That's what we want to find out in science, but we don't know really at the beginning. And ultimate reality may be beyond science anyhow. So I think, and there's another meaning of objective, and that means shared perception. If we share one perception, with many people, with everyone, then we consider that objective. And that notion of objectivity is useful in science. For example, that we have 5 fingers, you know, that is a shared experience. And so we call that objective, that humans have 5 fingers. We call that objective. But seeing auras around the fingers, that is not shared by too many people, at least not according to my experience. And so that would be considered subjective. Why subjective? Because it's not widely shared. But does that mean that it's less real because it's not widely shared? I think some exceptional people some visionaries may have insights that go far beyond common perceptions and may go even deeper. They remain subjective. They are not shared, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are less real. And on the other hand, what is shared also is not necessarily real just because it's shared. Now, it was a surprise to me my whole life. When I taught, I sometimes talked about auras, and my students asked me, can you see auras? And I had to admit, no, I've read much about it, but I cannot see it. But after I retired, And I meditated a lot. I sat there one evening, looked at my hands, and my hands were full of light. I had seen a book before called Light, Hands of Light or something like that. I don't recall the exact title. And in that, on the book cover, there were two hands and again, full of light. And then that evening when I sat there, I saw exactly the same thing that I saw on this book cover. Suddenly, light in my hands. And after that, I could see beautiful auras around leaves and trees and people. And but I mean, when I talk to most people, they just shake their head or they think, well, maybe he's hallucinating, or I don't know. It's not a shared experience, it's a subjective experience. But just because it's not shared, that to me does not mean that therefore it is less real. Of course, it can be hallucination. Shared things, shared perceptions also can be hallucination. So I think we have to admit that there is something important in subjectivity as there is something important in objectivity. But subjectivity is, of course, not desired in science because science is based on shared experience, and therefore subjectivity goes beyond science. And again, to me, this is very important to recognize that. And I think it's unfortunate that subjectivity, especially among scientists, is often denigrated as, well, unreal or less real than what science is dealing about, but it need not be so. And therefore, I think it is important. I think one could almost say that in our culture, there is maybe a bias towards subjectivity, especially since science has become such an important force. Objectivity, shared experience has been more valued, I think. And I think both are important, but to me, going beyond objectivity, beyond what is shared, I think is highly important. And if we look at the history of humankind, I mean, there have been many unusual visionaries with deep insight. These were subjective experiences, and these experiences have enriched humankind very much. So I think it's very important. Now, let me say something about logic. I think one can probably say that most scientists still take Aristotelian logic for granted. Aristotelian logic that is based on so-called laws of thought. They are first the law of identity, A is A. The second one is the law of contradiction. Something cannot be A and not A. And the third one is the law of the excluded middle, which means something is either B or it is not B. It cannot be anything in between, the excluded middle. It's either or thinking. And there are profound problems with all these three so-called laws. First of all, the law of identity. As far as I know and as far as I have seen, identity does not exist in the real world. Identity exists in logic and mathematics, but not in the real world. Because in the real world, you may have situations where something comes very close to identity, but absolute identity, I don't think exists in the real world. So this is a very questionable law. The second one, contradiction. Something cannot be A and not A. Well, in that respect, at least in quantum physics and a few other fields, progress has been made because now it's recognized since Niels Bohr that light can be both particle and wave, or can manifest as both particle and wave. So it can be wave and non-wave, or particle and non-particle. It can be both and. So there's this principle of complementarity, which really means both and logic. in contrast to either or logic. I've carried out research with a colleague in Switzerland, and we use that principle of complementarity in morphology because there are, again, different theories that are often considered contradictory, but one can consider them as complementary. And when we consider contradictory theories as complementary, we actually enrich our scope, because what one theory doesn't show or illuminate, the other one, which may appear contradictory, may illuminate that. So to me, it's unfortunate that not too many scientists use the principle of complementarity. Many scientists, and of course also many non-scientists, are stuck in either or, which restricts our scope very much. And then the third so-called law, the principle, the law of excluded middle. Well, some people see that easily, that black and white are linked by gray, by intermediate zone, but it's not seen so generally in other situations. For example, very few people would acknowledge that something can be both true and false. They usually would say it either has to be true or it has to be false. Or people would say either a person is good or a person is bad, or a person is honest or a person is dishonest, not honest, and so on. So, but I think this the principle that goes, the principle that goes beyond either or thinking, because beyond the excluded middle, can be very widely used. And it is widely used in fuzzy logic. Fuzzy logic was developed in the 60s. And what it means really is that you don't have sets that exclude one another, so that something may be either a member of a set or not a member of a set. Either you are, something is true or not true in that set. So in fuzzy set theory, sets are a matter of degree. So things or members of a fuzzy set belong to it to some degree, ranging from 0% to 100%. So you see the extremes, they include actually normal set theory, either or. But fuzzy set theory has the whole continuum from 0 to 100%. And I think this applies in many, many situations. Give you just a few examples. I mean, the fuzzy set of tall people. Well, it's obviously to ask, is someone tall or not tall, is not a good question. It's a good question in extreme cases, where 100% or 0%, but in between, one can be a member of that fuzzy set to some degree, to some extent, or the fuzzy set of happy people, or the fuzzy set of honest people, or the fuzzy set of dishonest people, or the fuzzy set of goodness, or the fuzzy set of evil, of justice. All these are fuzzy sets, because the closer you look at situations, I think the fuzzier the world becomes. The fuzzier the world becomes. That's my experience. So I think fuzzy set theory is an enormous advantage, but unfortunately, it's not widely recognized. I think I would like to propose, I think that science also is a fuzzy set. In fact, there's a very nice book about fuzzy logic by Cosco, published at the end of the last century. And he says, he concluded in his book that we live in a fuzzy world. And and that's my experience too. The closer we look, the fuzzier things become. And so fuzzy set is appropriate, whereas the law of the excluded middle is really very limited. It really applies only in the extreme cases of 0% or 100% membership in a fuzzy set. So it's more, fuzzy set theory is more inclusive. It includes the law of the excluded middle, but goes far beyond it. Yeah, now let me see. What I want to add to this is that we've had logic, kinds of logics that went beyond Aristotelian logic since antiquity. And unfortunately, this is not too well known. Maybe nowadays a little bit, but not too well known. One is yin-yang thinking in Taoism. As you know, yin contains yang and yang contains yin. So the question is not, is something either yin or yang? So it's always both yin and yang. One may be predominant, but the other one is always there. So there we have a good example of complementarity. Long ago, before Niels Bohr. So that is one thing. And if you know the yin-yang symbol, the yang goes gradually merges with the yin, gradually, and vice versa. So it's not an either-or situation. It's a matter of degree, how much is yin and how much is yang in any particular case. So we have fuzziness there also in the yin-yang thinking. And in Buddhist logic, in contrast to Aristotelian logic that has only two values, that is binary, either or, Buddhist logic has four values. It includes Aristotelian logic, it includes either or, but then it also has both and as a value, and neither nor. Neither nor, when something is neither nor, that I think goes already in a way beyond logic. And then we have Jaina logic, which we find in Jainism. And that is seven-valued logic, because according to Jaina logic, each statement has to be prefixed by a statement which says from this perspective or in a way or something like that. And there are, in Jaina logic, there are seven values. They are seven perspectives. They are, from this perspective, it is. From the second one, from another perspective, it is not. And from a third perspective, it would be, it is indescribable. And then the other perspectives are combinations of this. It is, and it is not. It is, and it is indescribable. It is not, and it is indescribable, and so on. So 7 perspectives for each statement. Imagine how this would, using this logic, how this would change our perspective and experience of the world. Because instead of saying, for example, this person is bad, we would have to say, from one perspective, or in a way, this person is bad. We would have to add, in another way, this person is not bad. And we would have, in yet another way, this person is indescribable. Or we would have to say, for example, this, from one perspective, this person is a terrorist. From another perspective, this person is not a terrorist. And from a third perspective, this person is indescribable. Now imagine what difference this would make in our understanding of terrorists, for example, or any people, good people, bad people, what have you, anything. To me, this logic is mind-blowing. I try to apply it in everyday life, but I forget so often because we are so much used to Aristotelian logic, and we just get so easily stuck in that. And that limits our experience and our view of the world, and so much. Yeah, and including in the logic, in Jain logic, the indescribable, that to me is also very important, because when we say it is indescribable, then we really go beyond science, because science uses language, and if something is indescribable, then it's beyond language, and so as a result, it's also beyond science. So yes, logic actually, especially Jaina logic, can lead us beyond science. And this brings me to language. I'm very interested in language. Language and mathematics, which is a form of language. Language can be likened to a map. And as Korsivsky said, a map is not the territory. We know that a map is not the territory. So a map, of course, conveys an aspect of the territory, but there is a lot more in the territory than any map can convey. And therefore, there is a lot more in reality than any linguistic representation, any language can convey, So this one has to keep this in mind, that this limits science then very much, because science uses language. And if science does no longer use language, well, then it's no longer science. But we can go personally, we can go beyond language. Well, just in silence. Silence is very important. And then, well, we are beyond. We are beyond language. We are beyond science. And this is very important to recognize. Korsivsky has made very important contributions to our understanding of language and the limitations of language. He said, he wrote that we should avoid the is in our sentences. We should avoid the is of predication and the is of identity. The is of predication is, for example, when you say John is good. That is the is of predication. But why should we avoid that? Because, well, what he actually is beyond language. And therefore, to say John is good is wrong, is a wrong statement. What he is beyond language, cannot be described through language, is the unnameable, is the indescribable. And therefore, Korsivsky said, whatever you say something or a person is, it is not. And the emphasis on say, what you say. When you say he is this, what he is being, is beyond what can be expressed through language. And the is of predication, of identity, would be to say he is a Christian or he is a terrorist. Again, what he actually is beyond that. It cannot be described. And for this reason, Korsivsky suggested that we should avoid the is of predication and the is of identity. And that is very difficult to do. I try to do that in my book, but I am not sure whether I always succeeded. And also when I talk, I'm not sure whether I always succeed. It's so easy to say he's that, or this is this, or whatever. But we should keep in mind, that's not what it is. What it is not. This is a revolutionary statement by Korzybski. So if we cannot avoid the is of identity and predication, the least thing we should do, according to Korzybski, is to, when we use the is, to add etc. That means instead of saying he is good, we should say he is good, etc. Because, or when we say he's bad, we should say he's bad, etc. And this, of course, opens the scope very, very much and makes it much more realistic. Or if we say he is a terrorist, we should say he's a terrorist, etc. Because terrorist is also a human being, and etc. So I think this adds a lot, and including that, etc. would be very important. But if you use that in common language, after some time, people may ask, what's wrong with you? But I think it would be a very important exercise. And if we don't say it, actually, at least keep it in mind. And I think many people have that in mind, but many people also don't have it in mind. And I'm not sure whether I always have it in mind. So I think Korzybski has made very, very good suggestions. Yeah, again, but the main point I want to stress is really that language is limited, and language cannot convey to us, cannot convey reality to us. And if we want to come closer to reality, we have to go beyond language. We have to become silent. Rumi said, the language of God is silence. I would prefer to say the language of reality is silence, but then of course it's no longer a language. We just have to know that we go beyond language. And I think there are many ways going beyond language, again, through many forms of meditation, and through many experiences, we can go beyond language. So again, the beyond to me is very important. And this is, of course, since science is limited to language, to use of language, this is, of course, a very severe limitations of science. And that's the reason why science, I think one can really say, I don't like to use the word never, but here I'm tempted to say that science never can reveal reality as it is. Science can at best reveal aspects of reality. And it has done, of course, already to a great extent, but there is a big difference between aspects of reality and reality as it is. So we have to go beyond. And now I would like to turn to the topic of empiricism. Well, science is considered empirical, and we often invoke the philosophy of empiricism with regard to science. But and empiricism means that in science, when we have theories and we want to test theories or other scientific generalizations, they have to be tested by facts. Facts are crucial, are basic in empiricism, and facts are described through language. And therefore, empiricism is limited because the facts are described through language, which is limited, which does not convey reality as it is. And I talked already about theory latentness of facts. So that is one limitation, one shortcoming empiricism. Empiricism really cannot reveal reality as it is for that reason. And but facts nonetheless remain very important. And we often are told that science, the strength of science is really that it is based on facts, that it is empirical, that it is based on facts. And that is correct, but that's only half of the story. Science is based on facts, on evidence, but very often science is also based on power, and very much so. The power of influential, powerful scientists, of powerful organizations, communities, even corporations, as we've seen it during the pandemic. So science, power plays a very, very important role in science. And this is a great limitation, in principle an unnecessary limitation, but it has become, I've seen my whole life that power plays a role in science. And Foucault, who coined the term power knowledge, he was mainly a historian, and he showed many examples during the history of how power has played a very important role. But to me, it has become even more evident while writing my book. It has become even more evident during the pandemic. During the pandemic, there has been so much reference to science, and it has been mainly reference to power science, to the power of powerful medical people, to powerful governments, to powerful communities, organizations, corporations like Big Pharma and so on. This has played a very, very important role during the pandemic, and many people don't seem to see that sufficiently. I mean, there have been scientists, very good and outstanding scientists working at some of the top universities in the world, like Oxford, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, who disagreed with power science about the official narrative that we were told again and again. Yet they were ignored, they were even suppressed, and because, well, science was dictated by the powerful elite. And I think this has had catastrophic consequences. I think this has led to a lot of unnecessary suffering, unnecessary sickness, unnecessary mortality, because I don't want to say that these scientists who disagreed with the official narrative necessarily had the truth. I don't want to say that, but they had an aspect, an important aspect of the truth that should have been considered and that was not considered, and that even nowadays, even today, is not considered. So this is actually very frightening. As I said, I worked for 40 years as a scientist. I could never imagine in my whole career that we would get to a point like that, because I find what has been happening just incredible. And even Nobel Prize winners, have been ignored. For example, Luc Montagnier, Nobel laureate in France, who actually discovered HIV virus. He's a specialist in virology. He thought that the whole vaccination program was a big mistake, has been a big mistake. Well, why did Why did we not even consider that? Why did we not listen to something? I'm not saying that he was necessarily right, but at least I think he should have been listened to, and his arguments should have been listened to. No. And the other sad things that is happening nowadays are the media. The media also seem to cooperate very much with power knowledge, power science. And so we are stuck to a great extent in power science. It need not be so. It could be differently, but how can we change it? Big question. I would like to hear from you in the discussion. So this is what I wanted to say about empiricism. No, one more thing, and that's about facts and sensory sense data that, of course, as you know, play an important role in empirical science. But sense data, as I said, are described through language, and therefore they are limited. But we can sense without, we can use our senses without describing our sense data. And so sensing without recourse to concepts and language can actually reveal an aspect of reality that is beyond empiricism. And I have a very nice quote here from William Blake, who said, "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear as it is infinite." So our senses actually can be a door to the infinite. But if the sense data are described in terms of language, then it's finite. Then we cannot see the infinite in it. But if we just sense, therefore I have a chapter heading in my book called Empiricism and Just Sensing, just sensing. If we just sense, then it could be a door beyond science and beyond the limitations of science. So that to me is also a very important consideration. And it's not easy, especially as for a scientist, a trained scientist, to just sense, because, for example, if as a botanist or a plant morphologist, if I walk through nature and I look at a tree, well, first thing I say, this is a tree, and the second thing I say is this is an oak tree or whatever. That's a description in terms of language. This is not just sensing. So just sensing is quite a challenge for a scientist like me. But I've learned a bit in this respect, but it's quite a challenge. So it's an interesting. I also want to say something not about just empirical science, but about science in general. I wanted to start my talk with that, and then I thought maybe it's better to just add that at the end if there's time left. I don't know, is there any time left?
Yes, sure. If you've got one more point to make, then do that.
Yeah. So what is science? It's not very clear. Very often we say science or scientific knowledge is knowledge that is gained through the scientific method. But as Paul Feyerabend and some others have pointed out, there is no scientific method. That means there is no method that is used by all scientists in all circumstances. Scientists use a great variety of methods. And so we cannot define science through the scientific method. That's quite revolutionary. That's almost shocking, but it makes sense to me. And to give you just a few examples why science cannot be defined by one scientific method. Well, one method that is often used is what's called the hypothetical deductive method. You have a theory, and that makes predictions, and then you test it, and you decide whether it confirms or disconfirms the theory. But not all scientists work this way. For example, Goethe, who is known as a poet, but who was also a scientist, he used much more intuition. Intuition was primary for him as a means of validation. Then there's a famous famous geneticist, Barbara McClintock, who won the Nobel Prize for her discovery of transposons, jumping genes that change their location. She actually said she did most of her work with corn, maize, and she actually reported that she got to a communion with her objects. There was no longer the observer-observed dichotomy. She got to a communion. Well, that's not what we normally understand through the scientific method. And then people, naturalists like Jane Goodall, I mean, who made so many interesting contributions. I think when she was sitting there and observing chimpanzees, she did not use the hypothetical deductive method, or she may have used that in addition to other methods. So if you look around among scientists, they use really a great variety of methodology, and one cannot single out one and say that is the scientific method. And that, of course, means that science cannot be delimited from non-science through the so-called scientific method. So we have to become more flexible. And this is the reason why I said maybe science is also a fuzzy set. Maybe there's no way to clearly distinguish science from non-science. Maybe it's a continuum. Maybe already chimpanzees have used a precursor of science because I don't know how they did it, but they knew if they had upset stomach, they knew which plant to eat. They didn't use trial and error. They did like it's used often in modern science. So they used intuition or instinct, or I don't know, maybe closer to something that Goethe did. These are all interesting questions. They are somewhat controversial. That's why I bring them up at the end. But I wanted to throw that in and maybe get some comments from you. So that's about it, I think.
Yeah, well, thank you very much indeed. You've given us a lot to think about, a lot of stimulation. Just before we break, I just wanted to mention, you mentioned Barbara McClintock, and there's a very good biography of her, which I'm sure you have, called A Feeling for the Organism,
yes.
And by Evelyn Fox Keller, which I was fascinated to read when a long time ago. And the other person who springs to mind in this respect is Victor Schauberger. Schauberger worked a lot with water and the earth, and forests, and particularly with water. What he learned about water and the dynamics of water came entirely from that method. In other words, he became the water, and then he understood what was happening. And so this is a kind of very refined, non-dual insight into something, because McClintock and the maze around her microscope, they weren't separate.
Yes.
She was the maze.
Yes.
In the same way as Schauberger was the water, or Goethe was the plant and its evolution. It's very important in Goethe to understand the process side and not, he never abstracts anything in its fixed form. He always looks to see what the morphology of the development dynamics are. So yes, there's another little snippet, but at this point we're going to take a 5-minute break, and so we're going to be back at 39 for some brief announcements, and then we'll open up for discussion. We've already got 2 hands up. So see you in 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Our speaker, and David Page has actually had his hand up for quite some time. He was keen to get in first. So David, it's over to you.
Yeah, no, I only had it up for about 5 minutes.
A bit longer, I think. But anyway, you're very welcome.
Thank you. Well, you know, what an avalanche of material we've heard. It's just absolutely amazing. And one of the last things, where are you? Rolf mentioned was something about sensation. And as a matter of fact, in the little group I was with before I came on here, the question about the distinction between sensation and perception arose. And and then Rolf, you mentioned when the doors of perception are cleansed, etc. You remember that? The doors of perception being cleansed. And I was just going to ask you, do you know anyone who has cleansed the doors of perception? Or how is your progress in that developing?
Very nice question.
Well, I have practiced for some time Tibetan Mahamudra, and there I've learned something interesting, because normally we look out, let's say we look out onto a tree, but according to Mahamudra, one should let the tree look into us, so sort of into the eye and in the back. And when I do this, actually the labeling and the conceptual overlay disappears. So this has been a very helpful method to me. And there is a book by Locke Kelly, I don't remember, freedom, something about freedom. And he refers to what he calls panoramic vision, where again, the perception, the senses come in from front and side and back, and again, through this vision, one would the labels would disappear. And for me, especially Mahamudra has really worked. So I can let it in, and there's no more label. That's big progress for me, because, as I said, as a scientist, I'm so used to putting labels on things.
And do you see the world as, Blake said, infinite in that circumstance? Infinite?
Well, it's time sort of time disappears, and space in a way too. So yes. So in that sense, yeah, I can see it brings us closer to the infinite and eternal.
Well, yes, thank you. We don't have Blake here really to explain exactly what he means. But I think it's a good answer. Let me just draw your attention to another new book, which is related to what we're talking about tonight. It's called Gaia Alchemy: The Reuniting of Science, Psyche and Soul by Stephen Harding at Schumacher College. I reviewed it for the new issue, so you'll be able to read about it. And he's speaking on 31st of August. Sorry, just the last 24th of August. And so I think what's very interesting there is that they is bringing in this alchemical transformative process. And he's obviously a biologist, field ecologist. So definitely a book for you, Rolf, that one.
Thank you. Thank you.
Roger, nice to see you.
Good to see you, David. So, Rolf, this was one of the most elucidating expositions of brilliance I've seen in my 9 decades of paying attention to clever people. Well done. Seriously, it was brilliant. So here we go now. Your statements about the importance of word definitions and using correct terms is right spot on. I think it was Socrates who's blamed for saying that a definition of terms is the beginning of wisdom. And the fact is, unless you actually clearly understand the definitions of the terms you're using, you can't come to any understanding. So that's a basic there. The next thing to say is that given that our spiritual existence is primary, and this is what we're trying to bring a recognition of to in community here, we find in my little research group, 100 odd people, have found that language equals a physical universe symbolic representation of spiritual concepts. What do you think of that?
Well, spiritual concepts, as long as they are concepts, to me, do not get to the core of reality, because again, they are formulated in terms of language, and so they can, at best, I think, represent an aspect of reality, maybe a very interesting aspect, and so I'm not against that.
Excellent. You and I would have a fun dinner chat together on this subject. Anytime you're in New York, it's on me.
Okay. Well, the other thing just to note is that the etymology of concept is from to grasp with. So capere is to grasp in Latin, and con is with. And so concepts are what we use to grasp something, which is a left hemisphere function. And it's necessarily an abstraction from the unbroken flowing reality, using a kind of David Bohm expression. But I've also been rereading today, because I'm writing a review of volume 2 of Ian McGilchrist's Matter with Things. And I was reading his chapter, rereading his chapter today on flow and movement. And flow and movement are primary, and pattern relationship are primary. And so the concept is secondary or derived in a sense.
Okay.
Dan. Yeah, lovely to see you too.
Yeah, maybe I could say something to Roger.
Yes, just do just finish that, and then we'll move
about definition. Of course, I agree with you that definitions are very important, but definitions always, a definition is in terms of some concepts, and these concepts again will have to be defined, and right. So it's a sort of infinite regret, and until we get to a point where we just have to give up, and we call these concepts, which we don't define anymore, than primitive terms. So there are some problems with definition too.
Yeah, in current 20th century understandings of the word concept, it is a thought form, but there are the nuances which need being ironed out, because when they are ironed out, then we can actually really come to some real accord on, you know, what we are finding in our investigations together.
Now, I think there's always an implicit aspect even of a definition. So what you're trying to do with a definition is to make things as explicit as possible.
Right.
But the actual nature of understanding, as Ian and others point out, is in fact intuitive and implicit. So without intuition, you can't understand anything.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, let's go to Suzanne from LA.
Well, hello. With you taking us into, Rolf, that territory between right and wrong, yes and no, that our culture is so embedded in, with a power structure that's power over rather than power for. We obviously need a radical upheaval of how we're going to run this world. And how can that occur? Well, you know, I have an idea that I've never spoken about. I'm thinking maybe I should write it up and see if I can get a piece into our newsletter. But it seems like a good time to just say something now about what I'm thinking. How we don't have a voice. we have many people speaking, but we don't have a voice. And in the structure, so that as it is, you know, it's right or wrong, and we're stuck, because what we want to talk about is a much broader point of view. Well, so I think that possibly the place to focus is to create a voice. Well, how could we do that? I've spoken to David about this. I have a thought. We should have an ad hoc power council. As David said, power operates through narrative control. I like that. He put that into the chat. Well, why don't we just take over, because we do. So this is what would happen. David would go first, and he's perfect because he probably knows more than anybody in the universe about everything in our world. He picks somebody else. Let's say he picks Oprah. David and Oprah together, they pick Jane Goodall, then etc. We get the most esteemed persons on earth to be a wisdom council. And if they deliberated on what they would do if they ran the world, everybody would listen. I think this is such a doable thing. It's such a simple thing.
Yes.
And yet it could be such a powerful thing. So how do we ever get, you know, particularly because evolution is a slow process, although humans have taken over a lot of evolution, and we really don't have time for the evolutionary, we probably don't have time for the evolutionary process to work its way out to where we get to the world we know we need to be in. So we need some radical moves. So I offer that one.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think that's a great idea, to contact people like Jane Goodall, and who are receptive to our ideas, and yet who have a very popular image also, because very often we talk only to people who, well, who are not so well known, who have done great work on one special area and so on, and they are not, they cannot change the world so easily. But if we could contact people who are in the popular culture, very well known, and who are, as you say, responsive to our ideas, that may really make a change. So congratulations, I'm all for that. It's a great idea, I think.
Great. Just a note on Jane Goodall, who I'm lucky enough to know, but I haven't seen her for a while. That those of you who are subscribers to Resurgence, there's a very good interview by Satish Kumar, and there's also a review of her new book on hope. So those are kind of resources for you to follow up. I'm not sure if those are actually on the Resurgence site. I might just have a look in a moment. But those of you who are subscribed to Resurgence, do have a look at those. I think I last heard Jane speak in public at a big forum, the State of the World Forum in 2000 in New York. It was the last State of the World Forum, organized by Jim Garrison. It was a quite extraordinary talk, because she speaks at the same time from the head and the heart and from experience. And there's a wonderful story about her, which was told by, I think I can't see on a biography, but I think it was actually Fred Matzer who talked about it. And he said that when Jane was very young, she didn't know how the eggs came out. And so aged about 4 or 5, she went and sat inside the hen house in the morning to see what happened. And her mum couldn't find her anywhere. And so she was very worried that she got lost. And then eventually she emerged from the hen house, but she still wasn't completely au fait with how this happened, because the eggs suddenly appeared. Anyway, I think it tells you something about the spirit of Jane Goodall, that she would, as a young girl, that she would go and sit in a hen house to see what was going to happen. So there you go. Thanks so much, Suzanne. As you know, we are looking to work on this and see what we can do. Sarah, from somewhere near Warwick, I think, at least that's where your university affiliation was.
I live in Oxford.
Okay.
And that's where I am.
Yeah, good.
Yes, thank you, Dave. I wanted to just reflect back on where we started, because I wrote down what you said, that you said science should know what it can say and what it can't. I think you probably meant scientists. But I was reflecting on that and what we can do about it. And I'm always curious about that word should, because there's something, how do we enable people to make movement? And I have really enjoyed Ken Wilber's writings. And I was struck as we were talking about their relevance here, because what he describes is phases of social development that happen like phases of child development or psychological development, and that trying to push a social group from one phase to another before it's ready is like trying to potty train a 1-year-old. It's not a sensible thing to do, and you don't get the solution you want. And from that perspective, it just feels like we're dealing with, in the Western world, a culture which is predominantly scientific rational. And that is the way they view the world. Now, many of us are thinking now in the next phase of development and the one after that. And as more and more people start thinking in those ways, the world will change. But we can't make it change. We cannot make 1-year-olds speak fluently. We can't, it will happen in its time. And what are the things that we can do to encourage that to happen more quickly? And I think to appreciate the worldview we're espousing here, and Rolf was talking about, because I'm totally at one with him on all those reflections on science, just to appreciate that view, to appreciate that it's real, that it is a next step from the scientific rational, and not to be diverted into worrying about the fact a lot of people hold the scientific rational view and living with the consequences of that, which Rolf so clearly described in the pandemic, where I think there was a lot of madness based on the power issues, but B, that way of thinking. So I'm curious to know what Rolf thinks about that and what other people think about that.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Very thoughtful.
Yeah, it's very difficult for me to see how things may change, because at the moment I see a collusion between a certain scientific elite that practices power knowledge and corporations like the pharmaceutical industry and governments, and it's very difficult to get a change in this situation. I think there is an interesting article coming out in the Paradigm Explorer by Joan Walton.
Yeah, on the politics of knowledge.
Yeah, on the politics of knowledge, yeah. And that article that I've read, that also shows how difficult it is to get out of it because of this collusion. I think the best way may be through education. If students would learn already early on in life, let's say Korsipski, it could start before kindergarten. When children ask, what is this? We usually tell them, this is a flower. That's where the indoctrination starts, because what we should tell them is, we call this a flower, What it
Oh,
is,
yeah.
we don't know. It's indescribable. It's and so from very early on in our upbringing, there is a conditioning. It's very hard to get over it. But if we could change education, I think that would be really very useful. But to change education, we would just have to educate the educators.
Well, you see, then one just goes one further back in the chain, because the reason education is how it is because society is as it is, governments are as they are, economics is as it is, social systems are as they are, and so it's a kind of catch-22. And I'm reminded of a remark that Willis Harman used to quote from Richard Feynman, who said, philosophy of science is to scientists what ornithology is to birds. It's a very funny remark, but it makes a serious point, rather the way that he used, because obviously the birds have no interest in ornithology at all. They don't even know what it is. And I do think that the philosophical and even theological naivete of scientists who haven't had any background in philosophy and history of ideas is a drawback. And when I used to teach at Winchester College in the 1980s, we had something called Div. And Div was one period a day, which was devoted to general studies and the study of books, so that your Div Don would recommend 4 books every term to study and write essays about. And you were in this system, whether you were a classicist on the arts side or a scientist. And so in other words, the scientists at Winchester had to carry on writing general essays right until the time they left. And I think as a kind of philosophy of education, it's terrific. And so I used some of the books I used to, I had Brian McGee's Introduction to Karl Popper. It's one of the books I got them to study. I did The Turning Point by Fritjof Capra, which had just come out at that time. I always used to do sacred text, the Bhagavad Gita, the Tao Te Ching, and I always had a Hermann Hesse novel in there somewhere. Those of you who know Hermann Hesse will understand why. It's quite subversive, and so I was like the Dead Poets Society at Winchester College. So anyway, Sarah, thank you very much indeed for that. Now we move to our president, Bernard Carr, who always has interesting questions as well.
Oh, I don't know about that. But anyway, thank you for a very interesting talk, Rolf. I mean, I have a few remarks, a few thoughts that it triggered, which I'd just like to mention. First of all, I was so glad you gave the Rumi quote about the language of God being silence. That's one of my favorite quotes. But it's often contrasted with another quote which says that the language of reality is mathematics. And although you said a lot about language, you didn't actually talk about mathematics, and I thought that was something which you might want to sort of say a little bit more about. At first I was puzzled. You talked about the 7 truth values of Jainism, and I thought, well, that's odd. But then I remembered John Barrow, who was well known to the SMN and a friend of mine. He actually he translated the 7 truth values of Jainism in his book Pie in the Sky, where I think he summarizes it really rather nicely. You made a reference to panoramic vision, and that reminded me that there's some fascinating work by Jean-Pierre Jourdain, where he was interviewing people who'd had near-death experiences. And one of the features of the near-death experience, at least early stages, is panoramic vision. And he has a model where when you have a near-death experience, you're sort of moving through a 5th dimension. And when you go a little way up through the 5th dimension, the first symptom of that, if you like, is having the panoramic or 360 degrees vision. And the other thought, David, relates to you, because I was fascinated when you pointed out that concept means grasping with. I'd never thought about that before. And I suppose the if you extend that, I mean, the word percept presumably means grasping through.
Indeed,
And the
indeed,
word, I suppose,
absolutely.
precept means grasping before. I mean, there must be lots of septs which I never thought about before. But anyway, Rolf, sorry, I've sort of, you know, I've thrown rather a number of points to you. I don't know which ones you want to react to, but maybe the point about language would mathematics as a language is triggered a thought.
Thank you, Bernard, for all these comments. Very interesting. I didn't say much about mathematics because I consider mathematics a form of language. And so what I said about language in a way also applies to mathematics. But I know there are people who think that mathematics is the language of nature, of reality.
Yeah.
Right. I don't agree with that because although my experience in that field is somewhat limited, the experience I have points against that. I have worked for some time with a mathematician in plant morphology. And what I've realized is when we want to approach plant morphology in terms of mathematics, we can gain really interesting insights, really very interesting insights. But we also have to make all sorts of simplifications. And so we somehow don't really completely capture nature as she is. And for that reason, I think mathematics is an extremely useful tool that can lead to great insights. But again, like language, I would say it conveys one aspect of reality, but not reality as it is. That's my view. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I mean, I agree that no language is going to capture all aspects of reality. From a point of view of a physicist, mathematics really does capture a large amount of reality. But of course, because, you know, the mathematics is intrinsic to the whole expression of the physical law. But I mean, on the other hand, I would never say that the physics is going to describe all of reality anyway. And you referred to experiences which show that. So in that sense, all language is limited. But nevertheless, I mean, I would say that some languages are more useful than others, and it depends upon what aspects of reality you're looking at.
Yes, it also depends on the field. I would think maybe mathematics works much better in physics than it works in the life sciences or in psychology or in social sciences. Would you agree with that?
Well, yes. I mean, it's certainly fundamental to physics. I mean, I don't have enough expertise in biology to answer your question very precisely, but it's clear that, I mean, many aspects of biology also have a strong mathematical aspect, and that analyzing mathematically gives lots of insight. So I would say almost all areas of science, including economics and sociology and things, do benefit from a mathematical analysis. It's hard to think of anything which can't be analyzed from a mathematical point of view. But that doesn't, and it's true that some areas of science, such as physics, depend much more fundamentally on mathematics. But none of that detracts from your more general remark that no area of science is actually apprehending all aspects of reality, which I think is the point you're making. That at some point you've got to go not only beyond space and time, but beyond language itself. And so I certainly agree with that.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks very much, Bernard. And I think it's worth mentioning the kind of another McGilchrist point, which is that there's a descriptive and an evocative function in language. So poetry is evocative, whereas prose is broadly descriptive. And so what poetry tries to do is to go beyond some of those limitations of language that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And so it brings a different quality, even if it's the same words. It's interesting. And then the other point you were just making about concepts, percepts, and so on, the same actually applies to comprehension, because to comprehend is also to grasp with.
Yes.
So prehendery is another word for grasping. And this is why Whitehead tried to reconstruct some of these terms. So he uses the word prehend or prehension in a technical way, as they call apprehend as well.
Yes.
And so I think looking at the etymology of words is something that David Bohm did a lot of, and I learned quite a lot from David Bohm. There's quite a bit of etymology actually in Wholeness and the Implicate Order, which probably none of us has read for about 40 years when it came out. Anyway, Bernard, thank you.
I'm not sure of the etymology of apprehension, presumably nothing grasping with an app in modern day parlance.
No, I think towards, probably.
Ah, towards,
yeah. Towards. It would be ad. It would be ad in Latin, I think.
Yeah.
Jeremy, welcome.
Thank you. Rolf, thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk. It's so good to hear somebody talking about the limits of science and what's beyond science. And because I think there's a lot of emphasis on expanding science in the SMN, and I think that's good, but we can't really expand science unless we've got an idea of actually how far it can go and where its limits are. And I thought your idea about science being a fuzzy set, or I suppose it's a collection of fuzzy sets really, with all the different sciences, was fascinating. And I think I go and say, well, so spirituality and religion, they're all sort of fuzzy sets. And actually anything that gets to anything fundamental is going to be a fuzzy set, because you can't actually define, put in language, put definitively, let alone certainly, anything which is real. There's always an abstraction immediately, or a distinction made whenever you try and speak. Even in maths, you count and you distinguish one number from other things. So I think this is really helpful. But one thing that I wanted you to comment on, which didn't mention in your description of science, is naturalism, which the idea that you can only really work with things from nature. And I'm wondering whether, like me, you find the concept incoherent, because where is the edge of nature? Where do we go into another way of knowing? And I think some of the examples, particularly something like Goethe, sort of shows that there's a real problem with that. And the more you get into an intuitive or a being present sort of way of learning, and you took back Jane Goodall, the less the naturalist thing sort of works, because you're moving into a spiritual understanding or perception as well. What do you think?
It's a difficult question. I guess it depends very much on which naturalist you have in mind. And again, I see there sort of continuum of fuzziness, and I wouldn't want to exclude anything. I think these different kinds of naturalists, they probably portray different aspects of nature, and so I would see them maybe as complementary and still useful.
Yeah, I suppose nature is itself a fuzzy set.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I mean, just a reminder, it's something everybody knows, that physics used to be called natural philosophy.
If only it still was.
Yeah,
It's
well, it's like
philosophy.
Economics was called political economy, and it still should be called
Which should be a branch of moral philosophy.
Indeed. I just want to ask Susan. She had a question really quite early on, and I don't know whether your question has developed a bit as you heard more from Rolf, but you might want to put your hand up and ask or tell us where your question has got to now. This is 2054. But in the meantime, we'll go over to our resident cricketer, Alan Morby, who always has cricket bats in the background.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Rolf. I'm really struggling with this question because in a way you've been answering it in much of what you said. And I've written the question down as, does science recognize the nature of creation sufficiently well? Or rather, is it sufficiently open to all the possibilities of the nature of creation? And where my question comes from is my understanding of Vedic philosophy is there are three realms: the physical realm, the mental or subtle realm, and the causal realm. And space and time, this is my understanding, and I feel this has tremendous explanatory power. Space and time seem to enter halfway into the subtle or mental realm. Now that then seems to nicely relate to David Bohm and the implicate order and the explicate order. But I have this sense that science, in searching for causes, as it does, gets rather sort of trapped in the physical, or maybe the physical and part of the mental. And the best it can do is talk about other dimensions. But even using the word dimension suggests more of the same of what we're used to. But this idea of physical, subtle, and causal realms, and the suggestion that the true causes, the real causes, exist or come from this causal realm, seems to be, well, not really present in science. Could you comment on that, please?
Yes, I tend to think that the causal realm is beyond science, but I think maybe the subtle realm can be reached by science. And I've read some interesting research about subtle energies by William Tiller, and also by some other experimenters who have shielded, who have put people that are close to each other into different kind of Faraday cages, so that they are shielded from electromagnetism, and yet there is a communication going on. So this to me is an example of investigation of subtle energies and how they may work. So it would be nice, I think, to expand science at least into the subtle realm, and I don't see much work in this direction, but maybe I'm just ignorant of it. But so that is really, I find really challenging. But as I said, causal realm, I don't see how this could be approached scientifically. But thank you very much for your interesting question.
Yes, thank you. I mean, Rudolf Steiner, I think, was someone who's tried to reach into these other realms with what he called the spiritual senses, and I think he would have recognized the this distinction between the mental and causal, or subtle and causal. So at a certain point, I think it becomes qualitative. And if the most of science is quantitatively based, but the qualitative, I mean, Goethe is a qualitative science, if you like. A science of qualities is Brian Goodwin's expression that he used also in relation to David Bohm. Anyway, yeah, thanks very much, Alan. And just before we come to you, Anne, I just want to ask if Susan, who I think is unmuted, whether you've got an update on your question and whether you'd like to put it.
Is that me, Susan?
No, sorry, Susan Wright.
No, yeah, I thought so.
Ah, okay, it's Susan Wright, Jerome, not Suzanne.
Yeah, sorry, I can't find her.
Oh, maybe she's gone. Okay, let's go on to Anne, and that'll give time for Susan to emerge if she is there. So Anne and Jeremy are together. So now I've got
yes, I'm there. I'm here.
Right. Okay.
It's just a little question, really, Rolf. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk, bringing so much together. Earlier on in your talk, I think you seem to suggest, or you were implying, that the subjective goes further. I don't know if that's exactly the language you use, but goes further than the objective. And I wondered if you could just say a little bit more about that, or what it was you did say, if
Yes.
I said it wrong.
No. That is my impression, that the subjective may go further. I'm not sure whether it always does, but if I think of great visionaries and spiritual masters like the Buddha and others, I mean, that their experience was subjective, and I think that went further than the ordinary kind of consciousness. So I think I would say subjective experience has at least the potential to go further. Whether it always does, I don't know. That's hard to tell.
Yes.
But
yes, I think Ravi would.
Whether or not I mean, I like the way the potential, but so many people in this world are brought up to not value their subjective experience, even on just a sort of simple level. So, but I know you're talking about deeper and other things when you're talking about the potential to go deeper or further.
Yes.
Yes, and I think Ravi Ravindra would say that there's a discipline involved in subtle perception, spiritual perception, as well as there is in physical perception. And so the training in yoga, the training of the attention, is a refinement of your capacity to perceive more qualitatively, more subtly. And so I think it's what he would say. There's a rigor involved in yoga, just as there is in science, but it's a slightly different form of rigor. Yes. I just want to say to Bruce here that we actually do have 2 talks coming up on synchronicity this year. One by Bethany Butzer in August, and then Bernard Beitman, who runs a kind of synchronicity podcast, he's going to give one, I think, in November. So watch the space. We have this one covered on synchronicity, which I think is particularly interesting. And in this book here, The Gaia Alchemy, Stephan Harding talks a lot about the Pauli-Jung conjecture and the unus mundus. So Rolf, is there anything you'd like to add by way of a kind of concluding comment? Because I think we've covered all the questions. We've had a very interesting discussion, really put you on the spot.
First,
yeah.
To your comment that about Ravi Ravindra, that it requires a certain rigor. I agree with that, but subjective insight can be also spontaneous. And there are many examples where people spontaneously had overwhelming insights. So it's both. I mean, I think it can come through rigor, it can come spontaneously too. Would you agree?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think if you look at the history of scientific discovery, then there are well-known, like Kekuli and the benzene rings. There are the well-known discoveries which came in a flash of insight. And in fact, there's no such thing as scientific discovery without imagination and intuition. Then you've got the hard part, which is to put it into mathematics and theory. Yeah. So any final thoughts from this evening or this afternoon for you?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for the invitation, and I want to thank all the commentators for these really interesting and revealing comments. So I'm really grateful for that. But in general, I would just like to add that I feel there is not sufficient recognition of the misconceptions I've been talking about in the general public and also among many scientists. And what can be done about that? I don't have a good solution. The best I've heard is really the suggestion that we should get in contact with people who are receptive to that and yet operate in the popular culture, like Jane Goodall or others. I cannot think of others, but that may be an important step forward. What do you think, David?
Yes, I mean, I think the you do need some exposure and training to these ideas, because I mean, if you think of probably your own scientific training, you probably learned about the limitations of science through your own study rather than being told about them in an undergraduate course. And I just think, I mean, the network itself was founded because scientists and medics were being trained in a materialistic way of understanding, as if this was the only way of understanding things. And this is still true, although obviously there's been huge advances in science since the 1970s. But unless you have some exposure to history of ideas, you know, finding out how ideas change, how ideas emerge, how the whole process works, and to examining your assumptions, which scientists are not really taught to do. So these are the philosophical presuppositions. This is what the Galileo report is partly about, because then you become more aware and self-reflexive. And so what we're advocating in the Galileo Commission is a self-reflexive science of consciousness, which is a term from Emilios Buratinos, which means you have to be aware of who's doing the science, who's doing the knowing, and then you become more subtle in your understanding and wider and deeper, I think, at the same time. And so I don't know how that can happen in a practical sense, because you'd be competing with all sorts of other things. But I suppose we could develop some sort of, short course for undergraduates and put it up online. So maybe there's something we could talk about, at least make it available, because we are trying to develop a postgraduate and young people's forum within the network. And so if you have young students and members of your family who you think would be interested, then get in touch with us. And because there is a program coming up, one on the 11th of June, then there are going to be regular kind of online coffee type meetings for young people. And part of the reason we're doing this is that we feel, as you say, that these are the people with flexible approaches who would be open to widening and deepening their understanding in the way we've been suggesting.
Yes.
Right. Well, Rolf, thank you very much indeed. We can let you get back to your piano if you got anything to play, or whatever other activity. You've given us a very instructive evening, a lot to think about. And if you haven't read Rolf's book, then I do recommend it. And you could also look at the book briefing that we did, which is on the members side. And you'll learn a bit more about the book and about the kind of questions that it examines. So we'll look forward to seeing you all again next week, or in the meantime at the bar or meditation. And thanks very much, Jerome, on the technical side. Thanks again, Rolf, and thank you all.